For this tutorial, I would like to introduce you to a new method for modeling. Up to now, we have been using what's referred to as box modeling or polygon modeling. In this tutorial, I would like to introduce spline modeling, a method by which one can create smooth surfaces is one thing that it's used for, and that we will use in this particular case to create chess pieces. And so this type of modeling is especially good for doing objects that are symmetrical and that have curved surfaces that might otherwise require a lot of polygonal geometry in order to smooth out. So let me demonstrate how to create a pawn using spline modeling along with the Lathe Tool. So the piece I'm going to create is down here. I've already docked it in my picture viewer. So one thing that I have found useful in working with spline modeling is to have a wireframe view in one workspace and a perspective view in another workspace. And so you can do that by going to Panel, open that up, go to Arrangement, and go down to two views side by side. So Cinema will rearrange your working space so that you have perspective on the left and the top view on the right. Now you don't want top view, of course, so go to Cameras and select Front. Now you've got the front view there. Now if I wanted to go back to my quad view, I can just go back to Panels, Arrangement, Four Views. And we're back to the way that we were, the default arrangement. Okay, so Panel, Arrangement, two views side by side. All right, so what I need to do is drag my template into my front view here and begin modeling. So find my template here and drag and drop it into my scene. Make sure that the sizes here are not rather ridiculous, because they can, depending upon your original bitmapped image, they can be rather bloated in terms of scale. So in this case, I'm having size Y about 400, which is still huge in terms of inches, but seems to work pretty well for our project here. When you're working with a lathed object, it needs to be symmetrical, and therefore it needs to be lined up in the middle here. So be sure your offset X is properly positioned here. Offset Y doesn't really matter, but offset X, it happens to be pretty well positioned in the center here. And that way, whatever we do on one side will be repeated on the other side symmetrically. All right, so now I need to also increase my transparency, of course, so I can see my spline better that I create. Then I'm going to go to this menu button here in the main menu, Spline Pen. I'm going to click on it. Now, if you want to open that menu up, you'll see there's a bunch of splines in here, but Spline Pen's the first one. So just click on that and that will activate your spline tool. All right, so here are its properties. We want type as Bezier in this particular case, and just leave the rest of the parameters at default. All right, so what we're going to do with the spline tool is that we're going to start at the center point, which is the y-axis, this green axis. We're going to start that center point, then we're going to build a profile, a spline profile, that duplicates as best we can the profile of the object, the pawn in this case, and then finish up at the top. So let's begin. Now in this case, again, we've got some perspective distortion on the bottom here, and so in order to accommodate that, I'm going to look at the corner over here and just come straight across more or less and place my first point right there. Just click with your left mouse button and place the first point. I'll come over to the edge here and just begin placing points. I can zoom in here a bit around the contour. And you just place a point wherever the profile changes direction or where there's a curve. Place a point there. Now you can add and delete points at any time along in the process here, so it's not critical necessarily how many points you place. You can always come back and add or subtract from them. So I'm going to place a point there in that curve. And those of you that have worked with splines before in a program like Illustrator, you know how splines work. So you're going to place a point here, one there, one here. I'm not going to place one there. I'm going to just use a spline to create that curve there, but I'm going to place one up here at the base of this flared portion, this disc-like portion. I'll place one there, and place one at the corner here, place one in the corner there. Now I may need to come back and add some more points in here in order to round off that corner the way I want. But in this case, I'm going to place two here, one right there, then another one just above it. All right, and you'll see why I did that later. And then the final one I'm going to place right at the very top. Then tap the space bar to drop the tool. Okay, so over here in your perspective view, you can see it doesn't look much like the pawn yet. Very angular, of course. But we're going to solve that with the thing that we do next, which is to activate the Bezier handles, the tangent handles, and begin creating the curves here that we want. Okay, so activate point mode so that your points show up here. The first thing that you want to do is select that top point or bottom point, doesn't really matter, top or bottom. The thing that's critical though is that that point be exactly on that green axis line. If it's off to one side or the other, you will create a hole in your mesh, at the top of your mesh. So if this top point is slightly off like that, or even just a little bit, you'll create a little hole in the top of your mesh, which is what you don't want, of course. It needs to be closed up there when we do what's called lathing it, which is going to take this spline and spin it in 360 degrees to create the full shape of the pawn. But since we want that point right there to be exactly on 0, select it, then go down here into the coordinate manager. That's the X direction. The red is the X direction, so go to the X and 0 that out. Just type a 0 in there. And then that places that point exactly on that axis. So do the same thing on the lower one. 0 that one out too. And then while you're here, this needs to have a flat bottom, right? Even though the perspective view of it shows a curve here, we know that that needs to be flat. So this point and that point need to be exactly across from each other on the y-axis. So while you have this vertex selected, go down to the coordinate manager and simply copy that value, then go to the other point and paste that value in. So now we know they're exactly across from each other. All right, now dismiss that or deselect that and right-click in empty space and then select Soft Interpolation. This is what adds the Bezier handles to your points. So Soft Interpolation. And you'll see that your spline will change configuration somewhat when you do that. Okay, so now what you need to do is with the Move tool, this doesn't work with Live Selected. It only works with the Move tool. Select and have your vertices active here. Then select the vertices and begin moving them into position along the profile. So what you're trying to do is to imitate the profile, match the profile as closely as possible with the Bezier handles and with the positioning of the points. Now later on you'll have to come back and make some adjustments here, but get it as close as you can to begin with. So when you click on each point, you'll see the Bezier handles show up, and that's what these white things are here. Those are the Bezier handles, these are the tangent handles. Okay. And so you can change the nature of the curve by moving those handles. All right, you can see here, you can come up with some pretty wild and crazy kind of curves. This will all be familiar to those of you that have worked with Illustrator. All right, so we're going to position these as best we can to start out with. Now be aware that when you move one, you move the other handle too, right? Okay, so sometimes that works, but usually that's not what you want. You want them to move independently of each other. In order to do that, hold down Shift while you click on whichever handle you want to manipulate, and then you can move that one independently of its companion. So I'm just going to try to follow that curve here, and you can see over here in your perspective view what that looks like. And here I want to hold down Shift and kind of adjust that curve. And again, we can look at our reference here to see what that curve needs to look like, if necessary. And likewise, hold down Shift and move that handle too to get that curve there. And you can see what's happening over here. All right. Now select the next one and go ahead and just work your way up the side of the profile, just trying to match the spline curve to the profile of the chess piece. Okay. Now you can only get just so accurate, but make sure that you get it as good as you can. Now here's one reason why I like to see it in the perspective views. If I deselect that, you can see I got a bump right here. I've got that little jog. And so you can't have those little jogs. You've got to adjust your curves in order to smooth those little jogs out. Okay, so it gets nice and smooth here. Now that may result in not having an exact conformation to the outline, but just do the best that you can. Now the other thing I want to warn you about is that you can't have 2 points selected at the same time and then try to manipulate them. Okay, your spline will not perform the way that you want it to. So always make sure that you're only working with one point at a time. Okay, so I'm just going to work my way up, and remember, you have to have this is done with the Move tool active, not the Live Select. Even though the manipulators look the same, this is the Move tool that I'm using. Okay, so I'm getting that curve. If I look at my template, this curve right here, trying to get that. And of course you can move the point if needed. Checking your profile here to make sure that it's looking the way that you think it's supposed to. See there, I got that a little jog in that again, so I need to adjust it with my tangent handle there in order to get the curve to be nice and smooth, no little bumps and jogs in it. By the way, if you do this accidentally in one of the orthogonal views, the way that you can get back is by holding down Shift, Command, Z. Tap Z as many times as you need to get back to where you were. So if I do this once and then do that again and do that again, I'll have to tap Shift, Command, Z 3 times to get me back. Or you can also go up to View and say Frame Default. That'll that'll kind of center your image in the screen, so it's better just to do Shift Command Z to get back to where you were, but if necessary, go to View, Frame Default, and that'll straighten out your image again. Because it's a common problem is that you accidentally move like this, rotate in an orthogonal view when you're not supposed to do that. Okay, so all right, so back here to my tangent handles. I'm going to try to adjust for that curve, and up here complete the adjustment to get that nice sweep. Now on this side, that needs to be rather flat right there. And then over here, again, make adjustments as needed. Let's see, I got two of them selected there, which it can get Cinema confused. So make sure that you only have one selected at a time. And here we've got our spline curve follows that edge pretty nicely already. So I'll select this one, move it down a little bit. What I'm trying to do here is create a little bit of a distance between these two so that when I do the lathe process, it creates kind of a little neck right there. You'll see what I mean when I do the lathe. So get that nice and smooth curve there. Now as I move out here, you can see that I can't get to my tangent handles anymore. And so what I need to do is hide that manipulator. And this is a rule of thumb that you want to remember. You can scoot in close like this, and then now you've got access to it. But if you're out here, it's kind of hard to get that handle. So do Option D, toggles that manipulator off. Now you can select it. Okay, and go ahead and make your curve as needed there, and then do Option D to toggle that back on again. So the top, I'm going to just get that straight across, each handle tangent to each other, and just keep that horizontal like that, and move my curve to try to match the curve of my reference. Again, get it as close as you can. You're going to come back and make some adjustments anyway, but get it close and then you don't have to make so many adjustments. Okay, so there is my profile in the perspective view. Good enough for right now, so select your spline. Now what you're going to do is lathe this. It's like lathing a piece of wood for a banister for a staircase. So select your spline, hold down Option so you can make it a child of the Lathe Tool. And then go to this button here, and one of the options here, this is kind of the extrude button. Go to the option here that says Lathe and just click on it, and there your pawn has been lathed. Want to see an interactive render of it? Looks pretty good just the way that it is. But we may need to make some adjustments. Now remember when I talked about this little neck right here, that's what I'm talking about there. You get that nice little merge from this shape into that shape. Makes it look like this is all carved from one single piece of wood, and you got kind of merged together there. Okay. All right, so now you want to make some adjustments here to the lathe. So with the lathe selected, we don't want so many subdivisions. Got lots of subdivisions here. We don't want that many subdivisions because we are going to use a subdivision surface algorithm in order to smooth this out. So we don't need lots of geometry here. So move that down to 12. Reduce that to 12, and you can see over here that your mesh becomes very polygonal, right? But the subdivision surface algorithm will smooth all of that out. Now as you zoom in on this, you can see that the lathe has created lots and lots of loops here. We don't need all those loops. Notice that the loops occur, this multitude of loops occurs where the surface curves or changes direction, like here on this corner. There aren't so many here where the surface is fairly constant. So you need to go in, as the creator, you need to go in and make adjustments for that. Because you don't want more geometry here than you need, and there's too much geometry here. You can see in this view, you got black, there's so many edges in those areas. Okay, so the way that you adjust this is go to the spline object. You've got the type is Bezier. Intermediate points is an option that adjusts how many loops we've got here. Okay, so if you open this up, you've got none. If you do none, then it looks like that, okay, with no intermediate points at all. If you do natural, it goes like this, where it gives you kind of regular spacing of edges, but notice that they're evenly spaced along here, and then a whole bunch of them along there, and then evenly spaced again. So that's natural. And then you've got uniform, where all the loops will be evenly spaced from top to bottom. And then you've got adaptive, which is the default, where again, where the surface doesn't change often, there are fewer loops. Where it changes quickly, there are many loops. Okay? So now you can control how many loops there are. Let's leave it at adaptive. By the way, don't do subdivided, because that gives you way too many loops, a mass of loops. So let's leave it at adaptive, and then the way that we adjust the number of loops is through the angle value. And so the higher you make that, the fewer loops there are. So what you do is you watch your model here, both in your wireframe view, your front view, and on your perspective view, and just watch the loops and how many there are or are not. And so if you raise that too high, you lose the shape of your profile. If you lower it too much, then you get billions of loops in there. So it's up to you to make that adjustment, find some compromise between fewer loops and maintaining the structure of your profile. So if it's 16 degrees right now, it's not too bad, because remember, we are going to add a subdivision surface to this, and while it's in subdivision surface mode, we can make some additional adjustments here. How you do that just comes through experience, and so one of the reasons you want to build a lot of different kinds of things for your daily doses and so forth is so that you can gain that experience. So angle 16 degrees, if I go higher, I go say to 20 degrees or so, I'm starting to have too few loops here in this neck, for example. So I'm going to stick with about 16. That way I've got 2 loops across that neck and gives me a fairly nice curve here. So I'll go with 16. Like I say, you can make adjustments here, and we will make adjustments after we take it to our next step, which is to add the subdivision surface to it all. All right, so in order to see the effects of the subdivision surface, we're going to select the lathe, hold down Option because we want to make the lathe a child of the subdivision surface. So go to the green sphere surrounded by the little wire cage and just click once on it, and that will add a subdivision surface to the object manager and make it a parent of the lathe. Okay, so now you've got a hierarchy here: subdivision surface, then the lathe, and the spline. So the spline creates our profile, the lathe turns it into a three-dimensional object and adds geometry, and then the subdivision surface smooths it all out. So let's take a look at it here in interactive render. So even though it has only 12 rotation segments, it's nice and smooth, right? But now you need to, while it's in this subdivision surface mode, you need to go back to your spline and make adjustments as needed, because subdivision surface does change somewhat the profile of your object. And so you go back here, and you can see here in my front view that subdivision surface has shrunk in my profile here, so it no longer matches the profile of my template. So I need to now go in and adjust the spline. So selecting the spline, you're working with the spline to do this. Again, move tool active, point mode. Now you come in and make some adjustments while it is in subdivision surface mode. Don't make wild adjustments, but subtle ones like what I'm doing here in order to try to match our curves up again. Okay, now remember, even after doing this, and keep an eye on what's happening over here in your perspective view as you make adjustments in your front view. But keep in mind that even after we do this, we still have the opportunity to go into our subdivision surface version of the model and make additional adjustments. So let's just get it as close as we can again, realigning our vertices here. And of course you can move your curves, your Bezier handles around here to try to get a nice curvature where needed. And again, keep an eye on the results over here in the perspective view, which is why you've got this open, is so you can see what the adjustments that you're making in your front view are doing to your perspective view. So let's continue our way, working our way around here for the time being. And as you can see, as you adjust the Bezier handles, you notice how the subdivision surface is reacting to it. Okay, so subdivision surface has kind of pulled our profile in there a bit, so we're going to pull that back out slightly. Now at this point, you can see how my spline is more angular right here, whereas my subdivision surface mesh is more curved off. Okay, so I'm going to come in and take care of that after I have frozen the lathe object into the finished form, and then I'll go in and make adjustments as needed to tighten up these curves like we've tightened up curves before. So I'm going to select those two there and move them simultaneously out. Again, trying to match up my profile. And this can involve some subtle adjustments. It takes some time to work through it. And again, you can always go back and look at your reference here to decide what these edges are supposed to look like, what the profile looks like. I think everything is working okay right there, but you can see that the sphere at the top is not quite the way it should be. So I'm going to grab that one and adjust its handle until I can kind of match that profile. Same thing up here, got kind of a point. It's almost like it's pear-shaped here instead of spherical like our reference is here. It looks like a pretty consistent sphere, not pear-shaped the way this one is. So I obviously need to come out here and pull that out until I can get it rounder. Now notice as I do that, I'm going out beyond the edge of my reference here, so I need to decide whether I need to go in there and make adjustments there to try to make that align, while at the same time trying to keep a nice rounded surface here. It's all about subtle adjustments, right? And sometimes you have to make some compromises in order to make it work. And be sure that the top of your sphere is flat. Don't let the subdivision surface do that to you, okay, where it becomes a little bit more, like I say, a little bit more oblong or pear-shaped. Okay, so that works pretty well that way, all right? So now what I'm going to do is to freeze the lathe. Okay, so I'm just going to select it here and tap C. That will freeze all of those, that lathing operation into a geometry. I'm going to rename my lathe to Pawn. And then for whatever reason, Cinema generates all these selection tags here, which you don't need, so just select them and delete them. Okay. So now you've got your pawn that is a spline that has been lathed into the shape that you want. You might need to go in and make some additional adjustments to it here, because you're trying to get it to look like this reference here, all right? So a few things as I look at this and I look at my reference of my template over, or my reference over here, I can see that there's probably a few things I need to make adjustments on. For example, right here, that's too much of a curve, right? Like I mentioned earlier. I'm going to adjust that in my subdivision surface mode. And then here, I got a pretty sharp edge right there, which I don't really want. And then as I look at my reference, that's pretty smooth curve here. That's pretty angular, sharp curve right there. So I need to make adjustments there. And down here looks pretty good, although it gets a little angular right there, and so I need to make some adjustments there. So what I'm going to do is toggle my subdivision surface off. So as you know, if you activate your subdivision surface and tap Q, that turns it off temporarily. I'm going to dismiss my interactive render here. Now remember, this area right here needed to be sharpened. So you know how to sharpen subdivision surfaces. It's with control edges. So KL gives me a loop. I can put a loop here and a loop there on either side of that edge. And now when I activate my subdivision surface and look at that, now I've got a tighter corner right there. All right. So if I undo those, so you can see what it looked like before, see that is too smooth. But now if I redo them, now I've got it tightened up with two control edges. So let me move my interactive render over here a little bit so you can see them. So there they are, those two edges right there. Those two loops right there are the loops that I used to control this edge right here and tighten it up. So if you don't understand subdivision surfaces, then you need to go back and watch my tutorial on subdivision surfaces so you know how to handle these projects that use subdivision surface, because virtually all of our projects from now on are going to be using subdivision surfaces and control edges. So you need to know how to handle those. Okay. All right, so what else? As I look at this little collar right here, it looks like these are fairly sharp corners right there. Mine are very smooth corners. So with my pawn, I'll just leave my subdivision surface active and then select my pawn, then go KL, and it gets a little bit confusing with all these subdivision surface lines visible in here, but you can kind of look at the wire mesh. You can just barely see that wire mesh. And you can see that as I'm coming down the edge here, I'm getting closer to the corner, and I just drop it in there, and you can see how that's tightened up there. I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom, control edge there, to tighten that up. Okay, so now those are tighter corners like I see here in my reference. Now if it needs to be even tighter, then go in and add another control edge below the original loop right there. You can see how that has now tightened that up. All right? So you work your way around the whole mesh, cleaning it up and making adjustments as needed. Now I'm going to look at this area right here next, so I'm going to turn off my interactive render. I'll also toggle my subdivision surface off. And I don't know why Cinema has done this, or Maxon has done this, but in editing mode, when you have the subdivision surface active by itself, it gives you this white kind of gray with very light colored lines. It makes it hard to see. See if we choose another different. Well, if you choose to display garage shading with lines, that helps, but it doesn't work so well with constant shading with lines. It just turns too pale gray. So let's go with garage shading with lines for the time being so we can see both our mesh and our edges. Okay, so as I zoom in on this, I can see that I got two loops right here close to each other. That could be causing that corner to be too sharp when I turn on Subdivision Surface. So let me activate Subdivision Surface. And it gets fairly sharp right there. Let's do an interactive render so I can see it. See, that's pretty sharp right here. I want that to be a smoother curve. So what I'm going to do is select Edge Mode. Okay, so I'm going to go in and select with UL, select that loop right there, and I'm going to simply dissolve it. All right. Now I can see here that's smoother, doesn't have such a sharp corner right there. Now I know it may seem to you like that's just a picky little detail, but it's details like that that make your model look good. Okay, and so you have to take the time to go in and make adjustments and clean things up. So down here I've tightened up this corner and I've rounded off that one just a little bit. Now again, as I look at my interactive render here, this I see is too smooth right there. Over here I see kind of an edge or a corner right here, so I need to try to add that in there, and I'll do it, of course, with a loop tool, KL. I'll add a loop right there and see whether that helps. Helped a little bit. Let's go back and maybe add a loop above the original loop. Okay, so that's tighter there now. Okay. But down here is too sharp there. So I need to go in, UL, and select some of these edges. There are too many edges in here. So I need to select some of those and just dissolve them one at a time until I can get it looking the way that I want. Let's try dissolving that one. Yeah, see, that helps round that off so it's not quite so sharp right there. That looks fairly good. Let's go in and maybe don't need that one. It's like you're sculpting here, just piece at a time until you get everything working just the way that you want it. Okay, well that looks pretty good. Let's look down here at this curve right here. That's fairly sharp there, so maybe I can go in and dissolve that one too, so it gets a little bit smoother curve. That looks better. And then down here, I got a bit of a problem right in here. So I think that I'll select that loop and dissolve it to get a little bit more curve. That loop was kind of flattening things out a little bit. Let's see whether if I dissolve this one, what happens? That's too much. Okay, so I'm still getting kind of a flattening of the curve right here. So what I'm going to do here is to use a different tool called a slide tool. So I'm going to go right click and select slide. What this allows me to do is make a selection of edges or points and just slide them along another edge. So I'm just going to slide them along that edge just by moving my mouse, holding my left mouse button down and moving it left or right, slides it along that edge. So I slid it down a bit. Now I'm going to scale it. So scale it up a little bit. Maybe select this one and scale it up a little bit. What I'm trying to do is get a nice round curve right here. So that's working pretty well. I like that. Okay. And then down here, this looks pretty good right there. But maybe a little rounded off on the bottom here. That's a fairly sharp corner right there. So again, KL, go in and sharpen that up a little bit. Okay, so I think that with those adjustments, Look at my subdivision surface. Check my pawn over. Nicely, looks good all around. Nice merges, good angles, good smooth curves. And once I have all that to my liking, then that's how you use the pen spline tool with the lathe option to create these nice symmetrical objects like this. So you can do some great bases with this kind of stuff. Anyway, anything that is symmetrical like this pawn, the lathe and spline tool combination works really well for that. But you do have to be willing to go in and make adjustments as needed, and sometimes they can be a little tedious, but still need to be done in order to come up with your best version. Okay, so if we drop a light in here, of course, just to see what we've created. I always recommend putting lights into your scene. Even if you're practicing, put some lights in there so you get used to setting up a good lighting solution with your scenes right from the get-go. So let's go with 50% light there, no specular, and looks fairly decent. Okay, so this is the method by which you're going to create your chess pieces. All of the chess pieces except for the knight will be created this way, although the tops of the chess pieces will be generated in a different manner and then be merged with the body, as you'll see in the tutorials that I post in terms of creating the king and queen and rook and bishop. Then we'll see a different way of using the spline tool in order to create the knight, which won't be lathed because obviously it's not a symmetrical shape. And I'll have a tutorial for that for you so you can see how to make the knight later. So good luck with learning the spline tool, and I'd recommend that you practice it so it becomes familiar to you in terms of how to handle it.